I just want to end by discussing traversing the fantasy. One thing you'll always hear Lacanians and Zizekians talk about is traversing the fantasy. I think it has almost a mythic status now. And yet, if you ask for a clear answer on what that means, you often don't get it. And so, again, I know I've been more quote heavy this lecture than last time, but I think it's important just to see what Zizek says.
It's very good.
Words.
We appreciate it. It's good.
Yeah, and so I got two examples, and I'm going to read them in full here. One is from the Ticklish Subject, and the other is from Event. And second one's a bit longer, but here's the one from Ticklish Subject. This is on page 58. He says, okay, well, before we get into it, so the whole point is traversing the fantasy, right? It sounds like, okay, I have this fundamental fantasy operating within me, or this fundamental fantasy operating in society. I guess the idea is to get beyond fantasy entirely, to live without fantasy, and to just perceive reality itself. But that's not true. The whole point is you're always going to have some kind of phantasmatic frame, some sort of perspective through which you experience reality. So it's not about just abolishing fantasy entirely. So here's how Zizek puts it. Traversing the fantasy precisely does not designate what this term suggests to a commonsensical approach, getting rid of the fantasies, of illusionary prejudices and misperceptions, which distort our view of reality, and finally learning to accept reality the way it actually is. That's not what it does for Zizek. He says, in traversing the fantasy, we do not learn to suspend our phantasmatic or phantasmagorical productions. On the contrary, we identify with the work of our imagination even more radically, in all its inconsistency. That is to say, prior to its transformation into the phantasmatic frame that guarantees our access to reality. So, let's be clear on what he's saying here. It's not that we ever just finally, once we... It's easier to do at a social level. It's easier to go, oh, I see that I have some consumer fantasy that's, determining my desire, right? Or I have some fascist or some Stalinist or whatever, right? That's easier to do because it's geared towards the generic side of yourself. But your actual fundamental fantasy, the idiosyncratic one that determines your individual libidinal economy, the point is, it's something that you can't fully integrate into your sense of self, right? Because once you're confronted with it, it's almost embarrassing that your entire life has been geared towards this stupid little image in your unconscious that you concocted, and how you've basically tried to live out this thing your whole life. And it's, in a sense, it's humiliating. It causes a sense of like being deflated, like, holy shit, my whole life was about this. This is so stupid. And so it's not so much you identify with it like how you do with your mirror image or with the things that you like. The identification more has to do with a confrontation with it. Like, holy shit, this thing has been unconscious, and now I'm consciously registering what has determined the whole history of my desire. And his point, as we're going to come to see, is just simply seeing the fundamental fantasy for what it is involves a traversal of it. So he doesn't flesh this out as much in the quote from Ticklish Subject, but he goes more into it in this quote from Event. And this is from pages 28 to 30. A little bit long, but it's worth it because he goes into more detail. He says, insofar as fantasy provides the frame which enables us to experience the real of our lives as a meaningful whole, the disintegration of a fantasy can have disastrous consequences, right? So the whole point is, your fantasy holds together your very life, your desire, right? If your fantasy somehow becomes shattered, say some tragic event happens and the fantasy frame is broken, this is not liberating, it destroys you, right? He says, a loss of the phantasmatic frame is often experienced in the midst of intense sexual activity. This is an interesting observation here. One is passionately engaged in the act, when all of a sudden, one, as it were, loses contact, disengages, begins to observe oneself from outside, and becomes aware of the mechanistic nonsense of one's repetitive movements. In such movements, the phantasmatic frame, which sustained the intensity of enjoyment, disintegrates, and we are confronted with the ludicrous real of copulation. Right? Think about like this moment during sex where the phantasmatic element, the context, right, all of that collapses, and it's just you and the other person and what your bodies are doing, right? Like, it's, as he points out, it's like ridiculous. You need that phantasmatic context for sex to be passionate, and if you lose that, then it's almost this weird, disgusting, awkward set of movements that, you know, like disgust you. You're just like, okay, it's the real of copulation, as he puts it. So he continues, what psychoanalysis aims at is not such a disintegration of fantasy, but something different and much more radical, the traversing of fantasy. And while it may seem obvious that psychoanalysis should liberate us from the hold of idiosyncratic fantasies and enable us to confront reality the way it is, this is precisely what Lacan does not have in mind. Traversing the fantasy does not mean simply going outside fantasy, but shattering its foundations, accepting its inconsistency, right? Part of it is just coming to terms with what your fundamental fantasy is masking, what it's veiling, right? Just simply recognizing what it's doing is this huge kind of realization, right? So he goes on, in our daily existence, we are immersed in reality. And again, for him, reality, and for Lacan, reality is our imaginary symbolic world, right? It's the world of language, custom, ego. It's all that kind of stuff, right? It's the imaginary and the symbolic are together what they call reality, as opposed to the real, which again, the real has to do with all of these various dynamics, the unconscious, drive, jouissance, all of these things, fundamental fantasy, that we're not aware of, right? That are out of sight, that are not immediately present as part of our waking social reality. So, sorry, to pick it up again. In our daily existence, we are immersed in reality, structured and supported by the fantasy. But this very immersion makes us blind to the fantasy frame which sustains our access to reality. To traverse the fantasy, therefore, means paradoxically to fully identify oneself with the fantasy, to bring the fantasy out. Here we can see what traversing the fantasy can mean, not to see through it and perceive the reality obfuscated by it, but to directly confront the fantasy as such. Once we do this, its hold over us is suspended. Why? Because fantasy remains operative only insofar as it functions as the transparent background, the unconscious, of our experience. Fantasy is like a dirty, intimate secret which cannot survive public exposure. So traversing the fantasy really just means bringing the fantasy to conscious awareness and identifying it. It's not that you integrate it. It's this humiliating thing that deflates your sense of self. Like, oh, my whole life's been based around this dumb shit. But the identification has to do with that realization that your whole life's been based around it, and that it's been operative throughout your whole life without you being aware of it. And the whole point is, the very moment that conscious awareness gets a grip on it, that the unconscious fantasy becomes conscious, it doesn't work anymore. It's stupid. It's ridiculous. It's some arbitrary little image or narrative that got established early on, but it's so contingent. And this is where you face this like subjective destitution, right? You feel like you've been emptied inside because you realize that what's been the most extimate thing, like the most intimate thing, is some dumb external image that you at the conscious level wouldn't identify with to begin with. It's just an image. It's just a little narrative, and yet it's been destinal, right? It's shaped your whole life. And once you realize this, though, the fantasy doesn't work the same anymore. I mean, this is part of psychoanalysis. It's not that every time something from the unconscious is made conscious, it ceases to be effective. But in this case, Zizek is arguing that fundamental fantasy, that is how it works here, where once you get a clear vision of it, once it's made conscious, once you understand what's going on with it, it can't really operate effectively anymore because you've had this confrontation with it and it's no longer stuck in the unconscious doing what it does. And so this is, I mean, the takeaway from this, again, to do this at the individual level, you'd have to go through analysis and that would be years, but it's really important for us to do this at the ideological level with our ideological fantasies, because once you do see how the ideological fantasy is working, right, there's the problem. Like, the Nazi, the German guy in Zizek's example, right? He can take his Jewish neighbor and turn it into an argument for the fantasy. But so he's having this experience of the neighbor, but it actually reaffirms the fantasy. What the German needed to do was confront the fantasy itself and see it for how arbitrary and ridiculous and contradictory it is. And that would be the breakdown in the Nazi ideology, would be an identification or confrontation with the fantasy itself, not what the fantasy is about, like not the empirical referent to the fantasy. You would have to confront the fantasy itself in order to get past it, to traverse it. So, I think with that, I think we're kind of done for the night, right?
The last thing was Harpoon Lobotomy had said is the concept of the thing being absent from self, or the concept of the thing, or both, either depending on context. And I would just clarify neither, and that Michael has his most popular blog post is about that concept. So do you want to just talk about that as a closer so I can link that in the chat?
So yeah, I mean, so the O.J. Petito, it is in a sense, you're right? I mean, it's the lost object that operates. Lacan doesn't use the word psyche, but we do, and I think it's helpful here. And it's not a real object, not an actual object, but it's almost as if it becomes incarnated in objects of desire, right? It's that X factor, the je ne sais quoi, right? That certain objects have that cause us to desire them. And so, yeah, the little a is the concept of this. I get this term from Deleuze, but I also like to call it a virtual object. So yeah, it's this weird little virtual object that is the effect of language more than anything, because to integrate into language, you have to take up rules. I mean, there's the syntactical rules of language, right? You have to speak a certain way to be operative within language, but the whole point of language, the first real meaningful instance of it for Lacan, which if we do this again, at some point we'll talk about his concept of the Oedipus complex. The first real meaningful linguistic event is what he calls the paternal metaphor. And it sounds overly complicated, but what it really has to do is it's the first instance of substitution, right? The child has to substitute the mother's desire. Up until this moment, the child's whole existence has been based on the mother's desire, right? Having a union with the mother, being connected to the mother, and at some point, some third person steps in, the quote father, and says, nope, this can't continue indefinitely. You have to separate. And this is where you exchange the mother's desire for the name of the father. And all that amounts to is you have to give up the immediate gratification you share with your primary caregiver and accept social normality, social protocol, law. And this is the first substitution. One thing is given up for another. And that is like the basic linguistic mechanism, right? Is there's substitution, and because of this, you lose the immediate gratification, and you pause it. I also like to talk about it as a ghost. O.J. Petito is like this ghost of an enjoyment that you think you had but you never had. It's a pure ghost, right? Because it's not like you had some alive, living enjoyment that then was killed off because of prohibition, because of law. No, it's a pure ghost, right? It's not. It's an enjoyment you posit or presuppose you had that you want to get back, but you didn't really ever have it. It was never that good. And so it's just the fact of language coming in, and language mediates everything, right? It's a whole system of mediation of relations. And prior to that, it's like you were wrapped up in a kind of immediacy, bodily immediacy, and you want like the ghost of that. And so that's what the little object is. And so I go into that in the blog posts, and there's a lot of other examples I give of trying to make this concept of objet petit a intelligible. So yeah, if you want to know more on that one, check out the you posted the link in the.
We interrupt this conversation for a quick message from our sponsors.
You may recognize this conversation from the past because it is actually a piece of a longer live stream. So what I've done is I've edited the conversations I had with Mikey down into smaller chunks, and I will be releasing those serially until the launch of the Slavoj Žižek's For They Know Not What They Do course, taught by Michael Downs and myself. I will be asking him the questions and hystericizing him, along with a cohort of people who will be joining us live and in the forums as we do a close reading of what Slavoj Žižek claims is his most important theoretical work, more important than Sublime Objective Ideology by far. He said that if you don't have anything to say about For They Know Not What They Do, then keep silent when it comes to Sublime Objective Ideology. But we don't just do close, thorough, hardcore readings. We also have some more introductory stuff. And so if you go to theory-underground.com/events, then you'll be able to see the dates of all of the upcoming events. You see that the Idea of University, taught by myself, Brian, and a couple of educators who are very close to me. And we wanted to focus on Karl Jasper's short work, The Idea of University, as a way to start the year, but it's also a way for Theory Underground to get off on the right track. January 25th is the Professional Managerial Class Consciousness course that I'm co-teaching with Elton LK of the Working Class Intelligentsia podcast. And then in February, on the 25th of February, launches Žižek's For They Know Not What They Do. Mikey has spent 2 decades getting himself to the point where he feels confident enough to teach this book. And I think that humility and effort that he's put in is something that we can all learn from. I mean, come on. He's like our own homegrown Žižek. He's like our own national treasure. I think that we really ought to uplift him and give credit where it's due, not just take him for granted and act like, we don't need to. So that's a part of the reason actually why I really appreciate Brian Becker from Singularity and Sublimity podcast. He's done a lot of amazing teaching work himself. A lot of people read the blog and then don't give credit where it's due. And that would be fine if he had a cushy academic career with tenure and all that. But he doesn't. He's working in a warehouse, supporting his mom. We need to hashtag free Mikey from wage labor so that he can spend more time doing what his passion is, which is teaching philosophy and theory, writing books. That's what we want. More of these kinds of conversations. Make it possible. Make a donation. 5, 15, 20, 50, 100. Make the donation today. Please. It means a lot. Words are cheap. Money, that's where it matters. Get your skin in the game. Show Mikey you care. I hope that we'll get to do a lot more of this in the near future. And then the last thing, I'm doing a countrywide tour this year. I will be on the East Coast, I will be on the West Coast, and I will be everywhere in between. So if you want me to come to your town or city, email me. It's down below. If you want to volunteer, be a part of the street team, host or guide while we're there, let me know. I hope to be in a city near you sometime this year, and I hope that you'll take one of my classes. Thanks.